Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I am so excited to welcome Bethany Joy Lenz to the podcast today. Now, many of you might know Joy from her portrayal of Haley in almost a decade-long run on the cult TV show called One Tree Hill. But what you might not know is that during her time on this show, she was actually involved in a real-life cult. As a former fundamentalist myself, I just knew I needed to have a conversation with Joy about her experiences. We had a great conversation about her early childhood as an actor, how she was drawn into this particular cult, and of course, our favorite part of all these stories, how she left and how she has healed since leaving a high control group. This conversation was fantastic, but if you want to go deeper into Joy's story, I highly encourage that you pick up a copy of Dinner for Vampires wherever books are sold. It's a New York Times bestseller for a reason. It's an absolutely fantastic book, and I know that all of you in my audience are going to resonate with aspects of her story. But that's enough from me for now. Go ahead and grab a copy of the book, and while you're doing that, let's get started with my conversation with Bethany Joy Lenz. Joy, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thanks for having me. This is so cool. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks, Eric.
I have to get a selfish question out of the way first.
Okay.
I'm a huge horror fan. And I have to ask you something about Stephen King's Thinner. Can you still do the Marlon Brando impression, or have you gotten a little rusty?
Oh my gosh. It's really been a minute. I don't even know what I say in that. It's like, I remember I stuck grapes in my cheeks. Something about this is the family.
You'll say this is justice. This is not justice.
Keep it up. I'll take your video card away.
You would not.
No. Promise, sweetheart.
I got a lot of, there was a lot of Italian mobster vibe happening in my particular high demand group. So I think we probably got a lot of practice in on that.
I know everybody's like One Tree Hill. Like that's the thing. They're like, that's the thing. And for me, I was like, Stephen King's Thinner. That's like immediately the thing that came to mind. And I rewatched
I wasn't sure
it.
If you were going to say Thinner or the So Cold the River, because Michael Carita also writes horror, and that was the last movie I did. I kind of forgot about Thinner. That's so funny. You're really like a diehard Stephen King fan, because that's an obscure one too.
Yeah. It was funny because when I was prepping for the interview, I put it on, and my wife sometimes has tolerance for horror movies and sometimes doesn't. And she's like, "Why are you watching this?" I was like, "It's research. I got to do this for the show." So it was well worth it.
That's good.
Right before hitting record, you were kind of talking about doing all the different press and interviews and like seeing where things landed for people. Some people obviously have no context with cults. Some people like myself do have context with that. And I think one of the things that stood out to me in your book was the section where you said, people find out you're in a cult and they go, "Oh, Scientology," or "Oh, NXIVM," or all these huge cults with 6 documentaries about them and tons of strange aesthetic things about them. But really, some of the most sinister cults are the kind of like under the radar, small Bible studies. And I think that's what most people are likely to get drawn into. With all the media around cults, why do you think there's still such an ignorance about what they actually are and how they operate?
Because they're undefinable. So you can't, there's no, legally, certainly they're undefinable, but even culturally, how are you supposed to know when something crosses over from just a group of friends who hang out a lot and have similar interests or worldviews to when something becomes unhealthy and controlling? There's no particular barometer for that. So I think maybe that's what's fascinating, is because we all want to know when does the line get crossed? How do we recognize it? You just seem to suddenly find yourself involved in these things. Not you, maybe you, but I did, and certainly a lot of other people. It's like, when did it change?
For you, I know obviously we can talk about when it actually changed, but I'm curious for you, like, when did you actually feel comfortable saying the C word? Like, when did you feel comfortable saying it's a cult? Because I know for myself, it was like, it was a really controlling group. I grew up in a little bit of a weird environment, but like it feels almost like melodramatic sometimes to say cult.
Yes.
But that is kind of what it is. Like, when did you feel comfortable actually like having that word come out of your mouth?
Comfortable. It took a while. I said it for the first time in a therapist's office. but it carried a lot of shame with it because of the stigma, because of this undefinable thing where it's just like cult is, it just means weird. It means stupid. It means gullible. And I never wanted to be associated with those words. So it took a while to be, I think part of the reason why even the cover of my book has a sense of humor to it, there's a tongue-in-cheek element to it, is because that was a part of the way of taking back ownership over the shame. Instead of feeling ashamed, it's like, yes, I made a really, I don't even know if I made a bad decision or if I was coerced into a bad decision, which it sounds like, I think as I've done more research and talked with more people, the more I'm prone to believe that that's what it was. But regardless, it was a misstep, a mistake. It was a bad situation. And should we all just walk around flogging ourselves for all of the bad situations that we got into? Or can we heal and have a sense of humor about some of it and know that we're not so different from each other? And so I think once I started to approach it that way, then it became much more of an easy, back pocket table trick when the room was quiet. It's like, well, did I ever tell you about when I was in a cult? Yeah. So it just kind of took the power back, I think.
Yeah. You mentioned like the word gullible, and I know there's so many words that are like kind of blamey about being in a cult, and I think it comes from a sense of pride, whether we're talking about ourselves and we go, it's denial, where it's like, oh, of course I'm not in a cult. Like, there's no way I got tricked into this. Or if we're, looking at other people, I'm sure some people read your book and went, how on earth did she fall for that? I would never, which is super arrogant to say because really good, smart, intelligent people get sucked into cults every single day. I think vulnerability is important to examine and to look at the things that kind of put you in danger. And I think people can learn a lot from those areas where you were vulnerable to a cultish group. What do you think were some of the traits of like a young Joy that made you particularly vulnerable to a culty group?
I would say my particular deep need was a longing for a place to belong, a family. I wanted to feel like in a life that I had lived with so much transientness and relationships were very unreliable because people would pass in and out of our lives because we moved a lot, and there was a lot of volatility in my parents' relationship and in their relationship with their own parents. And so the context that I had for family wasn't happy. It wasn't a terribly pleasant experience. And I would go to my friends' houses in high school or middle school, and I would see the way that their families interacted. I'd wake up after a sleepover and sit downstairs at my best friend Jenny's house with 7 other kids running around, and everybody's trading the waffles and the orange juice, and they say their breakfast prayer, and somebody's crying and the mom's making her feel better, and dad's throwing the keys across the kitchen to the older brother to jump in the car and get it started. And this sense of camaraderie and community, and everybody, one person's like, there were twins, so one was like doing homework off the other's sheet. It's like there's this sense of family that was healthy that I always wanted, and I craved it. And the closest I got was theater, which I write about in the book a bit and talk about how that community was so welcoming and so exciting, but it was all based on my ability to perform, because you don't get let in the door unless you can do something for the production. And it's also over within 3 months. You rehearse and then you do your show, and then it's not over, you move on. So I still couldn't quite be satisfied in that environment. And this particular church group, I mean, it wasn't even a church, it was a Bible study group, had all the makings of that family environment that I had always craved. So that was the biggest one for me that just made me, I wanted it more than anything else. So I was probably willing to overlook any gut reactions or red flags I might have felt for the sake of having what I thought would fulfill me.
With the performance background, like your first role at 7, playing a munchkin and like doing theater and doing film roles like we talked about, do you think that need to like be able to walk in a room and be accepted and to be able to read what people want from you and be malleable and take direction, do you think all those traits you learned that helped you as a performer also impacted like how you lived? Because I have to feel at like 7, 8, 9, you can't separate like, oh, this is my work persona and this is my at home. Like that's not all balanced
Yes.
yet. Do you think that played a part in how you
Yes.
interpreted that stuff?
It had to have. The understanding of my value, I feel most loved, most welcome in a place that's attached to my ability to perform, my ability to do something that I seem to excel at. So it created an excitement around high demand. I mean, 10, 11 years old, and I'm doing 8-hour Saturday rehearsals in a room full of adults. And I'm expected to be a professional and learn what that means and know all my lines and I didn't know just my lines. I knew everybody else's lines too, because I was an overachiever. I was a high performer and I was terrible in school. I couldn't succeed in my classroom because of the ADHD and that standardized learning made me totally hopeless at grades and testing. But I'd walk into a theater and I knew exactly what to do. I knew exactly how to perform and I got straight A's, so to speak. So yeah, I think that really informed my expectation on a very visceral level that I will be welcome in places where I can perform to a high demand and succeed.
This is a total aside. It's not even in my notes, but I'm curious, like starting acting that young, like looking back now as a parent, obviously yourself, would you have put yourself as a child in those rooms at that age? Like, because obviously it's led to some really amazing things for you, but it also obviously is a lot of pressure and affects a lot of other areas of your life. How do you look back at that period now?
I loved it more than anything else in the world. Maybe not as much as I loved God, but I did love it. And I couldn't give anybody else parenting advice because I don't know their kids. But for me, there's nowhere else I wanted to be. I would have scratched and clawed and found my way. I would have knocked on neighbors' doors to get a ride if my parents couldn't take me. So I was definitely meant to do this. Storytelling was part of my DNA. And I don't regret it. And I think that everything we have, everybody's got Achilles heels in their and blind spots in their life. So if it wasn't that, it was going to be something else. We all have things. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Well, and it certainly sounds like you weren't the type of person where it's like, like I read Jeanette McCurdy's book like a year or so ago, and it's like her mom dragging her to auditions. It doesn't sound like that was your background at all.
No,
it was the other way around.
Mom. Yes, for sure. No, the sacrifices she made to drive me from New Jersey into New York. We lived 45 minutes outside the city, and she did that drive like 4 times a week for voice lessons, dance lessons, auditions, acting classes, headshot sessions, meetings with my agent. Yeah, I mean, she definitely revolved her life around making it happen because she knew the way that a parent has an instinct about when you see your kid has a skill, you're like, okay, let's do it.
That's definitely something like I hope, as a parent, like every time I see a little faint interest in something, I'm like, let's pour every dollar into this thing while you're interested. Maybe that's just me because I was like forced to do piano for so long. Maybe I'm just trying to like even out the universe. Like here, we'll invest in something you like doing. Well,
can I ask you actually, because I, knowing that you grew up in your environment, I always wonder about that because I walked into something that it wasn't even a cult when it started. It became that when someone came in who had the pathological personality to do that with the group. And it was all just a perfect storm. But when you're raised in something like that, how do you start to see, like, how if your reality is what you've been told, how do you start to see outside of that?
That's so interesting. That's exactly what Nippy asked me. And I think it's because
Oh,
you guys came from similar backgrounds with this in terms of like joining
yeah.
something later. I honestly, for me, long story short, there was a youth pastor from a different church that got moved to our church, and it was part of a like sexual abuse cover up. And I Googled that. I
Yeah.
Googled his name in high school and stumbled across that, and then started really like digging into the movement itself and started asking leaders questions about it and got shut down a lot. So like I had a pretty blunt like wake up call moment, but there's also people I
Whoa.
know who grew up in it who have had moments like that that still don't question, that are like, oh, it's just propaganda and it's just this, like, so
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for anybody else. For me, it was just like such a clear, like, we say we're holier than thou in a city set on a hill, and we're, a light in the darkness. And we talk about all these other churches in the community for their music and for how they dress. But it's like, but we're also doing all the same things that pastors get up and talk about the Catholic Church, across town
Yeah.
doing. So it was a big wake up call for me. But like, I think now too, having access to the internet is such a different thing. Like I was talking to a
Yeah.
friend who is just a couple years older, and it's like my story being able to go Google somebody versus them being like, unless someone came in and told us, we didn't know, like, so
Yeah.
I think for this generation, like the iPhone generation, it's like, there's so many ways to find those cracks in the system. It just takes one Google search, even if it's a well-intentioned one like mine, to find some other information. And then you're like, oh, here's an article, like, and then you
Yeah.
go down that rabbit trail. So,
Wow. Yeah. But it's still, what's interesting that you said that's still true, that sometimes people still won't see it, that you can show them all the evidence. And I think this goes for a lot of things, not just I'm in a cult, but I think there's a lot of things where if some part of your personal identity is really wrapped up in your need to believe this thing, and someone shows you all the evidence, but you're like, I wonder if there's some kind of actual mental block that prevents people from being able to see what's right in front of them because the stakes are just too high. Like the internal protective mechanism of the entire construct of your identity that would have to be dismantled and reassembled if you were to shift your mindset. That's high stakes. I mean, yeah.
I mean, my background, I grew up I grew up from the time I was born till the time I graduated high school. Like I went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and then I went to school Monday through Friday, all on the same campus, same building. So like,
Yeah.
and my parents were on staff. So I literally spent more time at the church and school than at my house.
At
So like,
home, yeah.
yeah. So you're literally going, I'm getting rid of my community. I'm getting rid of my, if I get this wrong, am I going to spend eternity burning in hell? Like there's so much, like just little things like that are weighing over your head. And then I think too, you bring up a good point. I think there is that sunk cost fallacy of like, I've already spent this much time and I have this many good memories, where like, I look at your story, and people obviously can really read about this journey, but like you join a Bible study to escape kind of the pitfalls and dangers of the world and Hollywood and all the trauma of 9/11's happening. Like there's all these things that are coming together to go like, I need a safe haven. And it was that for so long that like it's gonna take a lot of bad to kind of tip that seesaw and go like, oh, it's not the same thing it was. Or was it ever?
Yeah.
Or like, that's the mental gymnastics you have to go through for the next several years is like, was it a good thing ever? Like, what is it?
That's the hard part about untangling when you get out of any kind of high demand situation. Even if it's a abusive relationship with one other person, understanding how things can, like, you were in the bizarro world version of things and you thought that was reality. And you get out to reality and you're like, okay, the street signs are still green, but in my reality, the street signs were green, but it meant that was water full of crocodiles. But here it's just a road and that's safe. But it looks the same. And so that's a weird analogy, but it's like I think trying to figure out what healthy versions of all of those things, everything that I experienced from a relationship with God, ideas about spirituality and the Bible, marriage, friendship, relationships, my relationship to work in the context of spirituality, organized religion, like all of those things, I had to reconstruct. I had to go back to square one.
Well, literally definitions of words are just, what does this mean? With the word specifically, like you talk about a lot in your book about like vocabulary that was used, like you call it Christianese, but like being called precious daughter, using the words family. And like, now that I've been out of all of this for a long time, it's starting to feel a little odd when I hear language like that, but it also feels very familiar. Do you also think like growing up, you said your parents in the book, you said they came out like the Jesus Revolution kind of hippie movement. So like a lot of the language that was being used probably didn't feel that out of place to you. Like,
no, it felt totally normal.
How can people, I guess, go about like analyzing going beyond what's just being said without being cynical? Like, because I think sometimes this goes both ways, right? Like someone could say, oh, this feels familiar, but obviously it's not the same as the family, Sunday school I was going to as a kid. It's a lot more sinister. But then there's also times where like you can leave a group and that vocabulary that was weaponized against you, now every time you hear it, you're cynical about it and you think that that person's using it in the same negative way. Like, how do you go about like reclaiming those kind of definitions and that vocabulary for yourself?
Isn't language so interesting? And it's not just in groups like this. Like it's on TikTok, it's on Instagram. Everybody's got every generation has buzzwords and keywords and things that mean something that used to mean something else at a different time. It's a slow process. It's a moment to moment. Family. I mean, I tell you, when I walk into any church now, and I hear somebody say like, well, good morning, family, I'm immediately like, who?
I'm out. I can't do it. Yeah.
Oh, we're a tribe. Oh, God.
Circles, not rows.
Yeah.
All the classics.
Yeah.
Let's do life together.
Let's do life together. It is hard, really hard. And I have to go inch by inch. And I have practiced using my voice a lot, asking questions a lot. I don't have time to pretend to be polite. If someone is saying something that seems strange to me, I'm going to stand up in church. I might one day. My grandmother used to, which is hilarious. I could totally see her doing that. She would stand right up in the middle of the congregation and say, "You're taking that out of context." I don't think I'd do that, but in a smaller setting, I feel much more comfortable now just saying like, I don't understand that. That sounds kind of strange and controlling. Can you explain what you're saying?
Yeah.
And if people respond well and are like, oh yeah, sorry, that shouldn't sound weird, but here, let me explain. That's a good sign. And if people get defensive, that's a bad sign.
Yeah. I was just about to say it's a good litmus test. Like if you ask those questions and a pastor goes, well, I'm the pastor, that's why I said it. It's like, well, that's probably a red flag. If somebody says like it, because I notice most people don't even realize like words just get said, and I've literally seen montages of the, hey, what's up, church family? Like everybody says that kind of stuff.
Of course.
They don't think that lands differently for someone who's been in that environment. So you joined the cult, well, the Bible study at least, right around the time you were starting One Tree Hill.
Mm-hmm. It was a bit before, actually.
Like was it 2 years? I was trying to remember. I didn't write down exactly.
No, I think it was about a year before.
A year before.
I had been living in LA for approximately a year when I got One Tree Hill. So I guess maybe it was like actually I got there and then April 9/11. So I don't do math, but maybe
Me either.
8 months. Maybe 8 months. I'm estimating.
Yeah, I'm bad at math too. So yada yada yada. You joined a cult. Obviously, this is like the start of what becomes a very dark period of life.
Yeah.
But also, this is like a really amazing, like career defining moment. Like this, I mean, decade long period of time.
Yeah.
Looking at that chunk of time from like 2003 to 13, do you look at that time and go like, my brain immediately snaps to all of those rough negative things, like all those really heavy things? Does it look at like, wow, what a whirlwind, there's all this amazing things that happen, like I'm singing with Gavin DeGraw somewhere, like randomly, like that pops up, like what does your brain automatically default to when you think about that chunk of time?
Well, I've had the great privilege to be faced with my younger self on a weekly basis through my podcast Drama Queens, where we rewatch the episode and then talk about our memories. So it's really unique in that I think probably most people who've experienced really heavy, dark times in their life in the midst of happy times may have a different, probably don't take a lot of time to go back on a regular basis and relive a lot of these moments. I think a lot of people just are like, yeah, that was a chunk of time. And I think about it sometimes. So I have been put in the unique position of being able to look at young Joy.
Literally so much footage.
Yes, episode by episode, and remember all the really good times, and also remember and being able to really see chronologically the impact it was having on me physically. I could see my weight gain. I could see my skin sometimes going through problems. I could see there was a point in season 7, we were just watching an episode, and I was like, oh my God, my eyes look so dead. And I had phoned in the performance for probably 3 episodes in a row. And I was like, wow, I think I remember what was happening then. And so when I look back, it's a jumble because I've had this current experience of reliving it very closely. But mostly, probably because of that, I feel fond memories. I think I've worked through most of the really hard ones, and they don't live in my body in a way that threatens me much anymore. And so I think I'm really able to think back on the fond memories, and I keep trying to live in that more and gain more of them, so that there is a lot of happiness in my life in that time and my memories. What a great question.
You know, growing up in it, it's the same way. It's like I have a chunk of time, and it's actually the same time frame. It's like 2000. I graduated in 2013, so it was like that same frame of time.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
it's like people ask about it and they go like, "Tell us about your childhood," and I'm like, I was in the same spot for all those years. So all of my best memories, worst memories, good memories, bad memories,
Yeah.
sad memories, like they're all there. And I think like doing the work to be able to go like, what are those good ones that I can spend some time thinking about? Like, you know, when I'm recounting those days to my kid, is it always going to be like, you know, stay tuned for this true crime podcast, you know, like of my life.
Yeah, Daddy, tell me a bedtime story.
Right. Yeah. So I was in a religious cult. Yeah, I was curious about that because it is such, I think you'd be justified to feel either type of way, but I'm glad that you do see that for what it is. And it would be extremely hard having to go back to that period, like going to events and signings and reunions and seeing that picture of Joy presented. Like I have to imagine sometimes that's a trip to be like, I remember where I was when that promo still was taken, you know?
But honestly, and it's another reason why I'm grateful for this whole experience, because I think it's so rare to be put in a position where you're really forced to examine all of your past choices and experiences. I think it's easiest for us to create a narrative in our head that makes us feel the best and move forward with that narrative and not look back. And that's just not cults. That's like if you have a breakup and you don't want to deal with the fact that you maybe played a part in it, or if you made a huge mistake in the way that your philosophy was around raising your kid, and then you see the ramifications of that 4 or 5 years later, and you're like, oh shit, that's because I believed this doctor instead of that doctor, or whatever. But we tell ourselves a story that make ourselves feel better, and we move on because it's easier. Shame is too hard to process. So I'm like, wow, what a gift that I had to go through all that, but I get the opportunity to go through and examine all of it so that I can release moment by moment by moment by moment. It's like, get out of my body, get out, get out, get out. It's okay. I forgive myself. Let's move on from that place instead of denial.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think is the difference between feeling shame and feeling personal responsibility? And I guess I look at that in terms of like, when you're bringing when you're bringing a friend into the group, or when you're, drawing someone into it, like, I feel like that sometimes. Like, I knocked almost every door in our city inviting people to our church, and you're like, I feel really guilty about that sometimes, it's like, but also like, it's not my fault.
You didn't know any better. What would you tell your kid? I mean, how old is your kid?
She's 7.
If she's in Girl Scouts and she goes knocking on doors and she's selling cookies, and the Girl Scouts had an issue at the factory and put out cookies that had like something that was going to make people sick. She's selling those cookies. He doesn't know. Like, she's going to feel awful seeing her best friend across the street sick from a box of cookies that she sold to them. But it's not her fault. He had no idea. And I think that's the same. That's how coercion works. You think that you're involved in something that's good because you trust people, because most people are not psychopaths, and you trust. And so there's this sense of like, in trusting, then somebody took advantage of that, and it's just not your fault. It's just not. I mean, I don't mean to be like Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting, but like that scene is so powerful because it's so true, and we all feel shame when we shouldn't. Not always. Sometimes shame is adequate, meaningful, important, but not in these cases. Not when you were coerced.
Yeah, not when you know your intent. Yeah, that is always a hard thing, and I forget who I heard say it, but someone was talking about like, you are responsible for the impact. You're responsible for the intent of your actions and the impact of your actions. And like, I think separating that in my mind to know, like, I can rest easy, and we spent time working with a missions organization, and there were things that were not great with how it was set up, and me and my wife look at it and go, we wanted to help orphans. That was our intent, like the impact of this leader, siphoning money to himself. I didn't know that. You know what I mean? So like, there's pieces like that where you have to separate that and also feel that like, yeah, I should have seen it, but now how will I see it moving forward? Like, how do I educate myself?
Why should you have at that young age, if that's all you knew? And me, I was 20, I was just doing what I knew and using the tools that I had at my disposal at that young age. But, that's what's interesting about that is as I've reconstructed faith, something that is what it's making me think of. What you're saying is making me think of how often the idea of sin is used in spiritual environments to be this thing that you're, what if I'm accidentally sinning? What if I'm like, what if I commit these great sins and I don't mean to, and I'm like, to release the idea. First of all, sin just means missing the mark. It's not some big, horrible, bad thing. It's an archery term that means missing the mark. So if I'm just missing the mark, but it's my intent is good, then there, that's where it's like, what kind of a God do you believe in? You believe in a God that's like expecting you to do everything perfectly? Because that's actually completely antithetical to what's in your big book, the Bible. But or do you believe in a God that is actually capable of understanding the intent of your heart and moving within that, and you're not condemned because you didn't know something? That's just so crazy to me. How could you be held responsible for something you don't know? Anyway, I didn't have a tangent, but
It's okay. This is a show where tangents happen often, so it comes with the territory.
You're creating so much space, Eric. So good.
It's like the Pharisees talking about, like, if you help somebody on the Sabbath, is that working? And it's like,
Yeah.
what's the intent? Like, you're serving somebody? Like, do you really think the letter of the law in that moment is what you need to be upholding? It's like
Right.
that. But it's hard to unwire all that. And especially when there's so much personal responsibility is weaponized so much in these environments where it's like your motives are always questioned. I know you obviously are familiar with that. I do want to ask about this because, you know, and I try to keep my One Tree Hill questions limited because I know that's probably what you're getting the most of.
It's okay.
With your context of being around so many people where you have two families, like you've got your work family that is like you're doing, I have to imagine some 15, 16-hour days with these people in these sets for years. Did anybody ever just straight up go like, Joy, what are you doing? Like, you're in a cult. And I want to ask on the back end of that, how do you wish people could have approached you to not make you go, this is persecution, I'm going to retreat further back into the group. I'm going to move myself away from the person challenging me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The first answer is yes, some people did come up and say flat out, I think you're in a cult. That was early on when we were still all getting to know each other, and the boundaries hadn't been established yet. And it was like, hey, I want to look out for you, kid. Like, I think you're in a cult. This sounds a little funky.
Was this like agents or was this like cast that was?
No, cast members.
Okay.
Yeah, people I was working with. And they said it in a way that felt non-threatening. It wasn't like a intervention or anything. It was much more just like, it was a casual warning because they didn't know me very well. And then I think as time went on, probably by the second year, it was really clear that this was my priority. These were my people that I called my family and spent most of my time with and considered first and foremost and consulted about decisions I was making in my life. And so at that point, I don't think there's anything anyone could have said that would have changed my mind or revealed something to me that I didn't know already. I had chosen who I would trust. And again, the intent of my heart was, I know I'm a flawed human being. I know I have a desire to, like, I've been in this business since I was a kid, and my dreams are, of course, to become a famous actress. And, you know, as every actor starts out young thinking. And I know that I'm in sort of my old soul wisdom. I think I was like, I'm susceptible to people manipulating me because of these little blind spots of mine, that, and I need a community of people around me who will help me and hold me accountable and support me and lift me up and give me guidance and wisdom, because I'm only 20. Like I'm going to need help here. I just chose the wrong group. but the intent of my heart was good and I think really beautiful. And so, yeah, I don't think there's anything anybody could have said. The people that stayed in my life that were the closest were a couple that were Catholic, and then there was some girls in the wardrobe department. And I wrote a little bit about this in my book. And just anybody that I knew. We had like a driver who I went to visit his Bible study a couple times in Wilmington. So anybody that shared my faith, I trusted a lot more, but they still couldn't have said like, hey, your core group back there is weird and somebody's manipulating you and this is bad. I wouldn't have believed it because I was already too far in.
Yeah. It's almost like when someone starts dating someone that has tons of red flags and you're like, I would not marry that girl. It's like, they're going to marry that person. They have to see it on their own.
I learned that the hard way. I had a girlfriend that was, when I was young, that was dating this guy that was red flags all over the place. His whole body was made of red flags. And I sat down with her and I was like, I don't think you should be dating this guy. And I definitely don't think, they were talking about getting engaged and it had only been a few months. And I was like, I think this is really bad. And I'm going to tell you why. And we were no longer friends after that conversation. And she got married to him and they ended up splitting up years later. And we had a very similar conversation years later where she said, if you couldn't have told me, nobody could have told me. She was my closest friend. And it's wild that you get in that mindset. And once you commit to what you think is going to fulfill you, come hell or high water, nobody else can intervene. So it's important if you know somebody in a situation like that, I think it's important to try and maintain the friendship. And like, you can share if you have concerns, but it has to be done in a really loving, gentle, careful way, and then back off and just give the person the autonomy and the respect of making their own decisions, even though you see a truck coming.
I almost feel like coming from that environment has helped me with empathy in terms of like, I don't know, like people talk about individuals who are in environments that are very toxic and they go, how, or believe something that's like ludicrous, I hear people talk about Scientologists and go like, why do they believe in Xenu, or whatever the thing is. And I'm like, I believed a lot of crazy stuff.
I agree with you on the empathy thing. It's made a huge difference in my perspective of other people who are militant in their beliefs. It can still be really frustrating, but I know what happens. I know how that happens. I know it in my body, how that happens. And whether that's, that doesn't have to be a religious extreme belief either. I think there's extremes all over and I get it. So, and I think for the most part, everybody's doing the same thing that you and I were doing. Good intent. They want the best in the world. They're trying to be whatever they think are the tenets and values of a good person. They're trying to model that based on their worldview, based on their upbringing and their past experiences. So it's really hard it's really hard for me to get upset with people for that. I get upset with bad drivers and I get upset with people who don't do their job efficiently. I get upset with people for different reasons, but not for having militant beliefs, which is weird because those are the things that I have family members who are like just enraged when they start talking about somebody from a different political group or a different, religious belief or whatever. And I used to do that, but I can't anymore. I can't in good conscience.
Well, and when you do that, you're not engaging with the belief, like you're just engaging with the person, which I think is like always going to push them to retreat back deeper into what they're in. Like when you start attacking somebody and going, you are this because you voted this way. You are this because you go to this church. And it's like, maybe they really think that, they're going to go to hell otherwise. Or maybe they really think that they're voting because this candidate promises. They believe they're going to do that, even if all facts prove otherwise. Like it's something to remind ourselves. And I think the more distance and the more healing we do, we can't lose that kind of like tenderness of going like, I remember how that felt to be in those shoes.
Also, what helps with the empathy is recognizing that we're storytellers. Our whole civilization from the beginning has been built around big stories and stories drawn on cave walls. Like, we are a people, we are a species of storytellers and story consumers. It's a foundational piece of humanity. So why not believe in Xenu? Why not believe in what Joseph Campbell found with the golden tablets or whatever? I think I'm getting that right.
Oh,
Why not?
Joseph Smith.
Joseph Smith, excuse me. Yeah, shows what I know. But why not believe that there's aliens and we're in a simulation? Like, there are so many versions of reality that you could believe. So it's really important that you're spending time using your critical thinking, because that's also the lizard brain, that muscle that we have to start dissecting these stories. We're made for stories. What are the stories that are true? And what are the stories that are covering up stories that we don't want to deal with being true? And how do we parcel those out? And I think that's sort of like a life journey. It can be a lifelong journey, but I think it's incredibly important, because otherwise, what else are we doing? You're just walking around wasting time. Like, figure it out.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And there's so much beauty in having those conversations with people who maybe all have a slightly different version of the story. But I think it's when you become dogmatic and say, anyone who doesn't share my story is not part of my club. And anybody who does share is, and anybody who starts changing the story is kicked out of the club. Like, that is where it becomes like, it gets so off the rails, where it's like, you don't cross this T that I cross. You don't dot this I that I dot. And, in reality, we're all trying to achieve essentially the same things, aside from, that percentage of people that's like actively trying to just accrue power, which is a totally different conversation.
Yes.
We're not talking about those. Don't make space for that.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I know we're getting close to the end here. You said something profound in the book where you talked about, I'll read it so I don't get it wrong, but you mentioned a showrunner, the showrunner's leverage over you is fame, and in the cult, the leader's leverage over you was eternal life. I guess, what would you say to somebody who is a 20-something stepping into show business or a career, and they have all these potential dangers and pitfalls that everyone talks about, like the drugs and alcohol and scandals and all the things that mention
just losing your identity. And
and then there's also losing your identity to a religious cult that promises to save you from those things. Like, what would you say to someone who is in their 20-somethings, is still trying to figure out life, like we all are at every age? Like, what can they do to proactively protect themselves from losing that identity, from just, relinquishing control and being like, okay, whatever this thing tells me to do, whatever this agent tells me to do, whatever this priest or pastor tells me to do, I'm just going to do that without questioning. Like, what advice would you give to like the 20-year-old Joy, if that 20-year-old Joy would listen?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question. It has something to do with shame, I think, and making mistakes and feeling the freedom to make mistakes, finding safe places that you can just mess up. I think that is one of the pain points culturally right now, is that nobody wants to make mistakes. Nobody wants to be seen as imperfect, especially the younger generation that is, if you're in your 20s, you grew up on the perfect Instagram, right? The perfect house.
Your digital footprint is everything. Yeah.
Yes. And your reputation, if you make a mistake, then everybody can come after you. And then what'll happen? Will you ever be able to get a job? How bad has your reputation been maligned? And so there's this policing over oneself that makes me sad. And the fear that if you make a mistake, bad things will happen. And so naturally people will look for systems to put into place to guarantee that they won't make mistakes, which was one of my big uh, blind spots as well, was this need I don't want to make mistakes. You tell me how to live so I don't have to make the mistake of making my own decisions and maybe screwing up. So if you can find a place to let shame, a place where shame goes to die, really, if you can find that place, then it should be more and more freeing and less confining. If you and go make mistakes, it's okay. I mean, don't go intentionally fuck up your life, but like move through the world in a thoughtful, meaningful way. Consider other people, care about your fellow man, and there are going to be decisions every day, from your coffee order to which way to drive home, to what job to take, where to move, what roommate to take in. And I don't know if there are wrong choices. I think most of the time you just make a choice. And if you're capable of surrendering that to a God of your understanding and just say, like, please, I hope I'm making the right choice. Help me, like, help guide me as I go. It's like, I don't think God can move a parked car. You kind of have to just put your foot on the gas and pick a direction, and then you can be steered where you need to go. So it's a little haphazard of an answer, but I hope that makes sense.
No, it's a great analogy. It's like, take the action, but listen. Like, at no point do you take your hands off the wheel and go like, if I see a warning sign, well, I pick this path, like
Yeah.
there's no like, oh, I've already driven this far, so I might as well keep going the really dangerous way that I'm going.
Yeah, no.
Yeah,
Just
I think that's
turn
great.
around.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you one last question here. So prepping for the interview, I had never watched a single episode of One Tree Hill. I'm so sorry, but I have now watched so many episodes of One Tree Hill.
You have.
So yeah, me and my wife
hooked?
I was like, well, I need to watch like one episode to like just get the vibe. And then I was like, I told my wife, Tara, I was like, this seems like your vibe of show. And then I was like, it kind of seems like my vibe too, because I grew up on like Smallville. I was like at this early 2000s, so we got sucked into it. We're like blasting through the series, trying to avoid spoilers for, a decade old show. And, but it's interesting watching the show, and then the intro music comes on, and it's all about identity. And it talks about, being tired of looking around rooms, wondering what you've got to do, who you're supposed to be, and you don't want to be anything other than you. It was interesting reading your book and then hearing those words, because your story is so much about who is Bethany Joy Lenz. Like, who am I supposed to be? I've got these people telling me to turn down these jobs. I've got this producer telling me to do this scene I'm not comfortable with. I've got this agent telling me not to do this. Now you've got such a reclamation of your life. You've taken it all. You've put it in a book that's, now sitting on my shelf behind me. Right now, who would you say Bethany Joy Lenz is? Like, what do you want to be known as to someone who maybe only knows you as one of those things? What do you hope people walk away from this interview knowing you to be?
It's hard. It's a hard question to answer, because I still have like a default allergy to saying nice things about myself. I'm working on it.
You get a free pass right now to say anything nice about yourself if you want to.
Thanks. At the end of the day, at the end of my life, I will have been many things: a mother, a writer, an actor, a musician, a creator, a friend, a daughter, maybe a wife. I don't know how many of those things will matter, except that I hope people think of me as kind and thoughtful and funny. I hope. I haven't been very funny in this interview, but I have good timing sometimes. But yeah, I would really like to be someone that is thought of as unafraid. I still feel a lot of fear in my life, but I I like actively pursue eradicating it when I recognize it. And I hope that's meaningful for people, some people in the next generation. You know, nobody will remember my name in 100 years, but maybe some of the things that I went through and learned could be transformed into lessons for people who then transform them into lessons for the next generation. And that would be really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this. I know you've been doing so much. And it's always interesting when I'm in a press tour where I'm like, you know, you were just doing like the Kelly Clarkson show and this, and then now doing, you know, this podcast. So thank you for making time and squeezing it in on the schedule. It really does mean a lot to me, and I know it will to the listeners.
I'm so glad. Thank you. You're so easy to talk to. Thanks for being so well prepared and asking really thought-provoking questions. And it was a nice conversation. I hope we get to talk again sometime.
Yeah, me too. Maybe book number 2.
Thank you. Hey, I'm working on it.